All right, hello everybody. My name is Anthony Rosa, and this is going to be the first episode in a lecture series I'm calling St. Paul and Stylometrics. If you hear some background noise, that's just my son enjoying his bouncer. He's right next to me. So, the purpose of this lecture series is to analyze the way that stylometrics is applied to Paul's corpus of letters. So there are 13 or 14, depending on whether you count Hebrews, alleged letters written by the historical figure of Paul, the early Christian figure. And some people will use the style of the letters. They will compare the style of the letters to make determinations about whether they think the alleged authorship is legitimate or illegitimate. So I'm starting with the end here, and this lecture series is going to be all about stylometrics, how it works, how it's applied to the Pauline corpus, a literature review, and then my own study on the subject. And we're going to be building towards this concept, which Dr. Bart Ehrman, puts forth pretty plainly in his book Forged, which is a good trade book to be introduced to issues of authenticity in the New Testament. So here's a couple quotes from chapter 3 here. First quote is, "The reasons for thinking Paul did not write Ephesians are numerous and compelling. For one thing, the writing style is not Paul's." Next quote, "That is one of the reasons scholars from the 19th century on have been convinced that Paul did not write the pastoral letters, which are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. The vocabulary and the writing style are very different from those of the other Pauline letters. And finally, the reasons for thinking that Colossians was not written by Paul are much the same as for Ephesians. Among other things, the writing style and contents of the book differ significantly from those in the undisputed letters of Paul." And he goes on and talks about a study, an old study done on that letter. So the premise that Bart Ehrman is putting forth is that Paul has a style of writing, and certain letters are different from the style of writing that Paul usually exhibits in letters that he for sure wrote. So all those are things Bart Ehrman is saying. And throughout this lecture series, we're going to be picking apart all of the nuanced claims that are implicit into these statements, and then looking at the explicit claims as well. Like I said, we'll finish off with actually a study that I've written on this topic. So for the first episode, these are going to be really short. This might be the longest one in the sense that the introduction is kind of explaining what's going on. But episode 1, what actually even is stylometrics? Probably a word most people are not familiar with. The prefix is style, stylo, which is a variant of the word style. And the etymology comes from the Latin stylus, according to Merriam-Webster, which has a reference to writing, or the writing utensil. So the prefix of stylo means style, and the suffix metry means measure. So when you put these two things together, you have the measurement of style. So stylometry is going to be measuring authorial styles. This could be written, spoken, doesn't matter. Since we're talking about letters, we're going to be principally discussing written, although we'll be doing a literature review on one of them that looks at the letters as they would have been spoken. So it does apply to both. And a note I want to make is that in stylometry, when we're talking about measuring something, what does it mean to measure a writing style? Well, this has undertones of mathematics. If you're going to measure something, right, there's a scientificity, there's a science to it, and it is mathematical in nature. If I'm going to take my ruler and measure something and then compare it to another measurement, we're going to be talking about a difference between the two measurements, and that's a mathematical discussion. So stylometry can really be framed also as the mathematical study of authorial styles, the mathematical study of an author's unique style. To get into an actual definition, this comes from the book Literary Detection, How to Prove Fraud and Authorship in Literature and Documents by Andrew Queen Morton. Andrew Queen Morton is, in a sense, a slightly controversial figure in modern day studies, just in the sense that all historical scholars are when new information arises. But he was really a pioneer in applying computational methods to stylometric studies. And here's his definition. So, stylometry is the science which describes and measures the personal elements in literary or extempore utterances so that it can be said that one particular person is responsible for the composition rather than any other person who might have been speaking or writing at that time of the same subject for similar reasons. So AQ Morton here is really using stylometry not in its prefix-suffix combination definition, but in its application. The application is actually part of his definition here, which is we are using it to distinguish authors. So by studying the style of authors, we can say this person's responsible for this writing, or this person's responsible for this writing. So studying writing styles helps us differentiate authorship of pieces. All right, so without all the jargon here, what's stylometry? Maybe there still is jargon, but we're going to be measuring the style of an author, which is through different linguistic features. These features can be high-level things, like the concepts they employ, how often do they employ a certain concept in a letter, or they can be a lower-level thing, like how many times do they use the Greek word kai, or how many times do they use this word, or how many times do they use these two words together. Those would be a lower-level feature of their writing. And by studying these, counting up these features and comparing them to other letters, we'll build a fingerprint, we'll build the stylome of that author. So we'll look at Paul's letters, we'll see what features he uses, and then if we can find commonalities in his corpus, we should be able to identify his style compared to another writer's style. At least, so stylometry claims. And the purpose, right, if we know an author's stylistic profile, we'll use this information to make probabilistic authorship claims. So nobody in stylometries that I know of, at least that's a scholar, is saying 100% we know X person wrote this, because in the humanities, of course, that's never certain. There's never certainty about history in general and the application of history. So we might be able to say, if I, Anthony, use the word kai 100 times every single letter, and then there's this other letter and it uses the kai 0 times, and my friend Jim never uses the word kai in any of his letters, and people are trying to figure out, did Anthony or Jim write this letter? Well, because I use the word kai and he doesn't, and the letter doesn't have the word kai, you can make a pretty high probability claim that between us, Jim is much more likely to have written the letter. And that's kind of how this works. So that's what stylometry is. In this next episode in this lecture series, I'm going to be discussing how stylometrics, how stylometry is applied, and we'll be using it, we'll be demonstrating how it's applied through Mosteller and Wallace's very famous study on the Federalist Papers.